Hi, my name is John Fox, and I'm coming to you live from my neighbor's studio here in San Francisco. I'm really bummed that I can't be there meeting you all in person. I guess maybe the silver lining for is that if we were all in person and still in the midst of a global pandemic, we probably all have to be wearing masks like this, and it's kind of hard to follow along when somebody's talking through a mask. So let's look on the bright side. We'll be able to hopefully see each other again in person, maybe next year, maybe sooner than that. But anyway, I want to talk about accessibility for iOS. And I wanted to say that I thought very purposefully about the title, Doing Well by Doing Good. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So, you know, if you take the time and trouble to care about making your application accessible to people who use various adaptive technologies like VoiceOver or, you know, voice control or any of these different great tools that we as iOS developers have, that is genuinely a good thing. It's a morally delightful thing to do. It shows that you really care. But I would also make the argument that by doing it, you're actually going to do a lot of, you'll do well. You'll do well by yourself as a software engineer, and you'll do well as a company providing a service out there. And I want to keep that theme in mind as we go through the technical aspects, which is mostly what I'll be focusing on while we're doing this talk. So I joined Netflix at the end of 2015, and pretty soon after, in 2016, early on, we launched the service globally. So we'd been available in a number of different countries, but we just basically turned it on for everywhere in the world except for China and Syria. And the hashtag that we used at the time was Netflix Everywhere. And since then, you know, we obviously had to do a lot of work to continually refine the application and make it work under a lot of different network conditions and keep adding languages and so forth. But really, I think as it concerns accessibility, you really want to think about it in terms of Netflix for everyone, which is really a very simple way of saying that if you want people to love your service and love your product, then you better make sure that it's welcoming for everybody. And that's why we have to care about accessibility. So as concerns iOS, accessibility really, as for software engineers, comes down to this massive protocol called UIAccessibility. And it covers a lot of different things, but in a nutshell, it's about really basically giving the various adaptive technologies like VoiceOver a chance to understand what your application does, how it does it, and to give hints to the users what will happen as they're navigating it using these technologies. So we're going to talk about three of the most important aspects of it right now. So one is traits, and a trait really has to do with what does this specific user interface element do? Is it a button? Is it a slider? Is it just some label? And in terms of label, kind of, it's a way of very concisely describing what the user interface element has to do. So it's a button, and how would you describe it? Is it a play button? Is it a pause button? Is it a stop button? Things like that. And then finally, a hint. And a hint is kind of marries the two. It basically gives an idea to the user. If I actuate this particular control, this is what's going to happen. This is what I can look forward to happening next. So these are the three things that we really want to take a look at right now. And so to get started, let's just look at the very simplest application we can imagine, truly the hello world of accessibility on iOS. And I'll give you some great news is that you don't have to do anything, because software engineers by our nature, we're very lazy. And so let's think about the simplest case and one where we just don't have to do anything, and that's UIButton. Now, were I in front of you, I would basically ask you, how many people out there have used an application, created an application that uses a UIButton? Of course, everybody's hand would go up. But the problem is that if you can't read, for instance, you can't see a button, how do you know anything that does it? So VoiceOver, if it's running, will allow you, will basically describe what's going on. You can almost think of it like audio description, and your application is a type of movie. So let's have a look at this little screen movie. So you see what I'm doing? I'm swiping with my thumb. And the way VoiceOver works is it basically goes through the entire view hierarchy and focuses on a particular element. That's why you see that focus element on it, that ring around it. And then it will read out the accessibility label for you. And if there's a hint, it will read that out as well. So that just identifies it. And you notice I'm swiping anywhere on the screen. So let's see the next screen movie, and you'll see that I can double tap.
Pause. Play.
And I can do it anywhere on the screen. It's focused on a particular element, and it's actuating, it's basically implementing whatever that control does. So it's sending a message, and whatever that message is will get invoked, and the change in state will then result in something being read. So let's just look at the code here. And so what I'm going to do here is highlight the important points. So for UIButton, its default accessibility label is the title label's text. So if there's a title in your button, which is pretty common, it's just going to read that out, whatever the current state of it is, and that's how you see that it tells the user what's going on. So that's great, but oftentimes people say, well, man or woman does not live by text alone. We like to have icons as well, and who doesn't like to have a picture in their application? And that's great, but that presents its own certain challenge. So if you can imagine what the code would look like for putting a simple button with an icon in it, would look something like this. Instead of setting text, you would set image for the various states of your button. And let's see what will happen with it. See, how does that play? Does it play well? So let's look at a little screen movie on that.
Play icon, button, play icon, button, play icon, play icon, button. Pause icon. Play icon. Pause icon.
Well, as it turns out, it doesn't really play very well at all. And the reason for that is pretty simple, is because it doesn't know what to do. And you can say that it kind of works because, as if you remember the code there, it basically says, set image, and the image was UI image with name. So the voiceover system was trying to do it best it possibly can. So lacking any other information, it decides, well, I'll just read the name of the icon. And because the programmer who wrote that code and wrote it in English kind of named the icon something that would be meaningful to them, that's what it read out. But what happens if you were in a different language? And since we're not in Lugano, we could ask the question, e se si parla italiano, what would happen if we speak Italian? So let's have a look there.
Play icon, pulsante, forse, play icon, pulsante, forse, play. 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 Pause icon.
I loved it so much.
Pulsante, forse, pause.
I loved it so much listening to it, I kind of got carried away, and I was tempted to launch GarageBand and make a new dance remix for my band Accessibility Playground. I would say that we could probably do a whole lot better than that, and let's see how we can do that. Let's look at some additional code here. So again, what I'm going to highlight here is that, first of all, we're going to work with localizable strings because we have love in our heart for users who speak all different languages. And what you're seeing is that I'm just calculating what would the label be based on the state of the button, the state of the world, and I'm explicitly setting the accessibility label on the button. So and rather than having it depend on a title label which is not used, I'm just going to say this is what the accessibility label should be. And in fact, when you do that and you provide it localizable strings like this, the world is just a much happier place. Now, one thing I wanted to point out as a kind of a hint is all my localizable strings I use for accessibility, I always put the little prefix A11Y. And in case you're wondering what that means, that's just a way of being lazy and not having to type out the words CCESSIBILIT, which are the 11 characters between A and Y. And so that's how it's kind of used as an abbreviation. But what I also like about it is that it reads to me like ally, and we should all want to be good allies to people who use adaptive technologies and just to our community of users in general. So let's go see how that works in English. And we can't forget about Italy and
Riproduci, pulsante. Pausa.
so it's just working great, and this is how you can make just a little bit of work makes things work really well when you have buttons that have icons in them and may not have text. So all right, well, that's very good, that's very simple, but what happens if you have a more sophisticated application with custom UI? Well, if you have custom UI, you're responsible for setting the traits and the hints and the labels. That's the bad news. The good news is that it's actually really easy to do, and so I would say you should make like a Nike ad and just do it. So let's see how. we're going to look at a real-world example. Now, I think a few of you have probably looked at the application a little bit, and you might have noticed up at the top of the screen, we have the N icon for our app logo, and we have TV shows and movies and lists. And so when you launch the application, that's what you'd see across the top of it. And I'm going to actually show a screen movie so we can see what these things do in action. But I just want to pay attention to the top of the screen first. So you see as they're tapping around, they can change the genre, they can change between TV shows and movies, and every time they do that change, there's a recalculation that's done. We go ask the server for a new Lolamo. A Lolamo means list of movies. It's just a way of describing the grid of titles that we display to users. And so it's works pretty nice, I think, but it does present some challenges for accessibility. So let's look about how we made that work. So first of all, I'm going to show another screen movie so you can see VoiceOver communicating that functionality to the user.
No active category filters. TV shows button. Filter by TV shows. TV shows. Remove all category filter. Currently showing TV shows. All genres. Selected. Selected. All genres. Button. All genres. Button. Audio description. Button. Select loading. Continue watching Ugly Delicious. Currently showing TV shows. Audio description.
So let's look at the code that we use for creating hints and traits for this. So the first thing you're going to look at is an accessibility hint. So again, I talked about that earlier. Instead of just saying something is a button and what's going to happen, what the label for it is, an accessibility hint kind of gives you an idea of what's going to happen next. So in this particular case, the UI is basically it's a bunch of UI views and some labels and a little image view to have a chevron that gets shown or hidden based on whether there's a filter state for it. And so we can adapt the hint based on the state. So if something is selected, then you can select a new filter, and if it's not, we can indicate that, and we can indicate kind of what the filtering will do. Is it going to filter by TV shows or movies or a genre or something like that? So that's really helpful. It's very simple. And then the accessibility label itself, I want to point out that you can have an accessibility label as just an empty string. If it doesn't do anything, that's one way of basically meaning that it won't read anything to the user until maybe it's a different state, in which case it would have a different label. And then the last thing is traits. And traits, you can actually have multiple of them, and that's very important because in this particular case, you want to indicate to the user that something is a button, but that it's actually selected as well. So you can combine those two as you see here, and that really helps paint a complete picture for somebody using VoiceOver. So now the other thing is that applications tend not to stay in a perfectly static state. As people use and enjoy them, the UI gets repainted, screens change, and you navigate. So there are all sorts of things that are going on there. And you have to really help explain what's going on to the user. And so let's look a little bit about change here. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that you have the ability to post notifications, and that's kind of a fundamental aspect of the UI accessibility protocol. So for instance, if you see here, I'm doing something where I'm saying I'm going to post a notification, and in this particular case, I'm posting a notification that there's been a layout change. And then the second argument that comes along there is, well, what's changed? Now, you can make it nil, in which case the system will do its best to figure it out. But if you want to focus on a specific item, you can do that. So in this particular case, self is a button that's up there in the view, and it will just focus it on there. And then the other thing that you can do is you can update labels as things change. Because in some case, again, if it's in a particular state, you might want to say that it has no trait because it's not going to do anything. But if it's in a situation where it can do something, well, then maybe you can change its trait, in this particular case, to button. So the important thing to know is that as your application changes, you're responsible for helping VoiceOver understand what's going on. So if something has changed, say so. And if your UI element's not going to do anything because of a particular state that it's in, you can help VoiceOver understand that as well. So you can handle change. Now, one way of handling change is through notifications, and we do it all the time. So in this particular case, we want to say, well, I care when some filtration was done and the Lolamo is finished reloading, we post a notification because there are a lot of interested parties who want to act on that. So we already had one that's in there. And when that's happening, then you can hook in and say, okay, great, now I know this particular work is done and I want to do something. And so what do I want to do? Well, let's help tell VoiceOver users what's going on. So you have this long-running, potentially long-running, asynchronous operation, and long-running is relative. It's not minutes. It's like milliseconds to seconds, depending on network conditions. And so it will just basically say, but we know now this one operation is done, and we want to go tell something, tell the user. So I have this method here called accessibility announce current status. And let's say, well, how do you write code for saying something? So it's pretty simple here. We just basically want to figure out, well, what's the state of the application? Are we filtered? Are we not filtered? If we are filtered, are we doing it by a genre? Whatever. This is kind of very simple stuff. In the end, you're just basically going to come up with a localized string that's created there, and we'll pass it back. And so that you've said what you want to say, and now we want to write the code to actually have it be said by VoiceOver, have it been announced. So that's when you want to make VoiceOver actually say something, you post a notification, but here the notification type is UI accessibility announcement notification, and the thing you pass to it is the string that you want read, and when you have that, everything is sunny and perfect. And so again, I want to talk a little bit about strings, and I need to highlight something else about stringing and stringing you along, is that it is very, very important, I think, to distinguish in your little notes about to not only putting that little prefix there gives the translator some idea that this text is to be spoken, and that's actually important because you can use things like commas to introduce some pauses in your string to make them sound more natural, and to be able to fill out things so that if you have something like 75M, that's going to read out as 75 meters, and you might have meant 75 minutes. So for example, you can have different strings that will have something different from what would be seen, and that's very, very important. So let's see. The other thing that I'd want to talk about is being kind. And so what does that mean? Well, earlier on when I was showing my screen movie, I wanted to point out something to you. So we have all these different genres. So you have like, action and anime and Asian, and so on and so forth. But what happens if you use VoiceOver? Now, if you use VoiceOver, one of the things that you're probably likely to do is probably be really interested in audio description, because an audio description will provide some context about what's going on when there's no actors talking. And so, what we found is that the audio description, it's a synthetic genre. It's not quite a way of describing something. It's not crime or anime, but it is something that's very, very important to people. But it happened to have been the last item on there. And so we thought, well, if you're already using VoiceOver, maybe we should help save people a lot of navigation by putting it up on the top. And that's exactly what we did. And we want to talk about how do we do that. Well, there is the UI accessibility VoiceOver status did change notification. It's a mouthful, but essentially what it does is it lets you as a developer react when somebody turns VoiceOver on or off. And one thing to know is that people will turn VoiceOver on and off. It's not there usually on all the time. Sometimes people will turn it off. So you need to be able to know when it has turned off so you can do things like handle the situation. So let's see. Let's write some code for handling. So what you see here is that we have we're going to add ourselves as an observer, for a particular notification name, and then we will invoke our method that we have here, and let's see what we might do here. So in this particular case, let's say that you had the genre menu that was already up on screen or about to go on screen, but somebody said, okay, I'm going to turn on VoiceOver. Well, in this particular case, then we can say, well, now we need to change something a little bit. So that notification allows you to handle things in the appropriate manner. And by the same token, when you're writing software and you're deciding should you use the ability to say something using VoiceOver, you kind of want to ask the question, "Mother, may I?" Now, this was a childhood game that I played. I know that there are other variations for it, but it's a way of kind of asking questions. May I do this? May I take 2 steps forward? May I do something like that? And so the equivalent for that in code is this little function called UI accessibility is VoiceOver running. And if you were to think about it for about half a second, you would say that what does it do? Well, it will tell you if VoiceOver is running, which is very helpful. So let's see how we might use that. So here's some code here that again allows us, while we're configuring our view and deciding what to do, well, we can just run that method, or ask that method, is VoiceOver running? And if it's so, then we might rearrange the items in a list, for example. And so that's a small detail, but it makes all the difference in the world for people who are using it. So next thing, knowing when to be silent. Now, when we're working on apps, it is true that as software engineers, we have big egos and we think we're the stars of the show and we should always be showing our user interface elements that we spend so much time working on, especially if we do animation and things like that. But sometimes being silent visually and auditorially can be very helpful. So I want to talk about a use case with interactive titles. So we're going to look at a little screen movie here. So tap it.
Netflix. Selected. Landscape.
And you can see that it's already done playback.
Rated TV PG.
You see how the controls eventually hide. Tension is building. I wonder what's going to go on here.
Front flip button. Back flip button.
So both the choices are readable,
Backflip button.
And you
Selected.
can choose
Backflip.
one. So this
Show
works.
controls button.
No! Okay, so we want to talk about a little bit what was going on here. So the first thing to know is that you notice that we had player controls who were on the screen, but then we wanted to turn them off. Why? Well, for lots of reasons. One is that just because somebody's using VoiceOver, it may not mean that they have absolutely no vision. They may have just low vision, or they may be watching with someone else, in which case the presence of those visual controls might be disturbing. So we tend to turn them off. And it also really helps because if you listen very carefully, every time that you post a notification saying that there's been a layout change, VoiceOver adds a little kind of a very specific audio bug. It kind of goes bop, bop, bop. And that's really helpful because it clues somebody who's using it, say that there's something for them to pay attention to. And you may have also noticed that there was a focus on the first element. So for interactive titles where it's basically saying you need to make a choice, we announce that there's a choice that has to be made, and then we'll focus on an element, and then they know, if somebody's using VoiceOver, know that they can swipe through and then figure out where they want to go with it. And so what we're going to do is look at the code and see how do we do that. So this is kind of the code that was presenting those what we call choice points. And you can see here's another case where at the end of the animation block, when we know every element is on the screen in the right location, that's a good time to be able to post a screen change notification and point it to the item. In this case, it's a view controller. And then VoiceOver will do the right thing. It will just basically do it in the order in which it appears. If you want to be more specific, more explicit about it, you can point it to a specific UI element. But in any case, it's basically it's working in concert with the VoiceOver system to provide a smooth experience. So that's really been helpful. So another kind of thing I want to talk about is a kind gesture. And you should know that VoiceOver uses lots of specialized gestures that people that aren't available when VoiceOver is not running, and that helps people navigate your application in a very smooth fashion. So let's look at an example with a screen movie. You can use the magic tap gesture, which is this two-finger tap, and that will toggle pause and play. So that, it's very easy for people to be able to navigate the video even if the controls aren't actually visible on the screen. The other thing that exists is the two-finger magic escape, which is basically a way of taking any screen and making it disappear. So for modal views like the player itself or the DP, that's one way. So again, what you saw there were just two gestures. One is this magic tap, which is a two-finger double tap, and it's used to be able to toggle on or off whatever is the most appropriate action. So if there's a video playing, that's really a good idea to toggle it. And that's very good because it's very fast to be able to do it. And the other thing, which is that magic Z gesture. And so again, if you have modal view controllers that are presenting full screen, when you post a notification that there's been a screen layout change, the little bop 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 that people will hear already gives them a clue that if they want to get rid of it, rather than having to navigate through and find the close button, they can just use a little Z. And it's such a great gesture. And so you can implement these in your view controllers and it goes a long way. So accessibility magic tap, this method will get called, and then you can do whatever you want to do. In this particular case, let's say toggle playback if it's something is playing, or just do nothing, and you're responsible for saying, did you complete the operation, did it work? And then the accessibility perform escape, a very typical thing to do is to be able to say, well, if you got a full screen view controller, just dismiss it, but whatever logic you might need to do, are you full screen, are you not, do you need to rotate, whatever it is that would normally happen for a sighted user, just do that thing, but this is the clue that somebody's explicitly asked for that particular operation to take place. All right, we're going to take a deep breath, have a glass of water. And I want to point to something else that I promised to you. So I would say that, when you work on accessibility, it really helps you see problems that that you may not have thought about very carefully or thoroughly, which as concerns design and user accessibility. So we're going to look at an example here. So this is what we call our display page. It's something that if you tap on a thumbnail in the Lolomo, up comes this screen, and it has lots of data in there in terms of synopses and release dates and all that kind of good stuff. But I want to point out something. So if you were to look at these items where it says this is the cast and this is the creator, would you intuitively know that you could tap on them? And the answer is that most people probably wouldn't, but in fact it is. And this is kind of interesting. So this is a case where for voiceover users, it works really well.
Cast, heading, Emma Stone, button, Jonah Hill, button, Jonah, back, button, back, close, button.
So it's kind of interesting. So first of all, let's see how we do that. But the thing I think you want to notice is that it had an overall label for the item to be able to say this is a header. And that's really important because it gives an indication to the user that there's additional items in there that they can then swipe through. And the trait of button, even though it's a substring in a text label, it is that if they tap on it or they double tap, that's going to invoke an action and it's going to show particular titles featuring that cast member or by that director. So let's see how the code works for that. So in this particular case, there's a component that I created called NFUI link label, and it's a UI label subclass, but here you can see that it's the evidence starring label. But the important thing is that we're setting an accessibility trait of header, and that's really, really helpful for it. And then the other thing we want to do is that we can basically say for each of the different substrings in there, like the names of the individual actors in a particular title, for example, we can create a UI accessibility element for it, which is basically something that describes a user interface element, describing it to the voiceover system. So it has the traits and the frame. Where is it on the screen in screen coordinates? And what is its trait? Is it a button? Is it a label? Whatever. And it will go through and read out all those different things for you. So this shows you that basically you can use these techniques to be able to make things that are kind of random user interface elements. Think about kind of OpenGL or kind of graphical elements, things that might be on screen that are not kind of buttons and sliders and things like that, but you can synthesize them. You can create your own for them, and this is an important kind of advanced feature that allows you to do things. But what's interesting about this particular case is that it kind of highlighted a design issue we have, is because this is a case where it actually works better for voiceover user than it does for people who don't have it running. So that kind of allowed us to go back and we're still thinking about it. How can we kind of visually indicate that this something can be tapped on, or you can do something without kind of doing the underline label that nobody really wants to have in a modern application. So I want to talk about repurposing. So we've done a lot to be able to make our application work smoothly in low network conditions, because you can go to certain parts of the world, like downtown San Francisco, and experience absolutely kind of third world network conditions. And so let's have a look at what that might be. And so if you look here, we're going to basically look at this application, and you'll see that, okay, I scroll through and I have all these different items on there, but what I'm going to do is go to the handy dandy debug menu that we have, and I'm going to turn on this mode where basically we just stop fetching images, and instead of having images on the screen, we have a little bit of text in there. So that was done kind of as for the purposes of kind of recreating that good feeling of navigating the internet in 1990, whenever, with a modem, and you would wait for a long time for your image just to appear line by line as it's scanning. And so it would be good practice to put a little title label on there, and that was very helpful. We stopped caring about that for the most part, but you notice when you're making your mobile app work in low network conditions, you kind of have to do that. So we'd had that in there, and all I did was adapt it a little bit to do a little test to be able to say, hey, is there a kind of a low bandwidth or rather a low vision mode we could put our application in? And the reason why is because box art images have different fonts, different colors, and so if you have low vision, you're scanning through it, you don't know where to go, and the font, the contrast, the color, the font size, it doesn't work very well for low vision users. So it's kind of like, it's a 2-for-1 special. You can make the page load faster by opting not to download these images and make it easier to read for somebody who is using your application. So it's a kind of like adapt a little bit and everything is really good. And so the point I would want to make about this whole thing is that accessibility is really, it's a shared practice. It's something that you want to be able to work on with your designers, with your customer support people, with everybody. Everybody is a stakeholder in this thing. And so I wanted to share one last thing with you because we're starting to run out of time. And this is a video that we made for an accessibility group at our company.
Coming March 13th. Heading.
Well, let's see what's coming March 13th.
Triple Frontier.
Okay, something called Triple Frontier.
A military helicopter soars over a hillside covered with tin roof houses.
Audio description is a narration track that plays alongside the video as you're watching. It conveys any plot-critical points that are happening on screen to help someone who is low vision or blind understand what's happening in between the dialogue.
Santiago glances back. Overlooking a thick patch of lush jungle, the SUV reverses into the foliage.
When I started losing my vision, I sort of checked out of TV and film without knowing what's going on screen. It wasn't all that interesting. Being able to contribute, participate, and talk about the content with friends and family has been much enriched with the use of audio description.
The black police vehicles from the convoy speed forward, surrounding the building and blocking the roads.
When you are a youth, that's how you meet friends, build a community, when you have a common topic. So you want to be able to, as a youth, have those types of common, hey, we like the same genre of things, we're watching the same show. Like, that's how normal conversations start. It's not just a call to have accessibility in a singular platform, but rather something that really enhances the quality of life and the whole human experience.
Working directly with the blind community, which is something that is made possible by interacting with an organization like the Lighthouse for the Blind, is the ability to understand, if I make this change, what will the effect be on a particular population, in this case, someone who's blind?
If somebody depends on voiceover, if you make a mistake and forget to label something, then you can render entire sections of the application completely opaque to these users. If you've ever watched somebody who needs this technology use it, then you become keenly aware, and you never want to ship something that fails.
We work with companies like Netflix to help make sure that the experience, even if it's good, can get better. And if it's better, let's try to make it best.
If that little segment didn't help pull your heartstrings, I don't know what can. There's so much more to be said about it, but we don't have a whole lot of time. I want to say grazie. Thank you, everybody. And I want to offer a particular thank you to Lighthouse for the Blind. They've been such huge assistance for us as we're trying to improve our application's accessibility. And I invite you all to stay in touch. You can find me on the internet, on Twitter, where all civil conversation takes place, where I'm Djembe, that's D-J-E-M-B-E, like the West African drum. And I hope to chat with you a bit further in the rooms, and where I can answer any questions you might have. Like, who is this person with the long beard, and why is his beard in my face? That's always a question that people always tend to have. All right, so I look forward to continuing the conversation, and we'll see you and talk to you soon. Thanks so much.